The cave mouth yawns open like a wound in the coral limestone, 20 feet above the churning Pacific. Inside, Marine Corporal James Anderson from Oregon freezes as his flashlight beam catches movement in the darkness. Not enemy soldiers preparing an ambush, something worse. A Japanese woman clutches two small children to her chest, their faces hollow with starvation, their eyes reflecting the light like animals cornered in a trap. She speaks no English. Anderson speaks no Japanese, but both understand what happens next. She begins backing toward the cave's rear opening, toward the 200-foot drop to the rocks below. Anderson raises his hand, palm out, shaking his head. She keeps moving backward. The children don't make a sound. This is Marpi Point, Saipan, July 1944, and what Marines are discovering in these caves will force them to confront an enemy they cannot defeat with bullets. An enemy that lives inside the human mind itself. If you want to understand the wars that shaped our world, that cost real blood and broke real families, subscribe now, because these aren't just history lessons, they're the truth we owe those who lived it. Saipan is a volcanic island 15 miles long and 6 miles wide, part of the Mariana Chain in the Central Pacific, approximately 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. In June 1944, it became the target of Operation Forager, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War to that date. The strategic calculus was brutal and simple. Capture Saipan, and American B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping strategy had brought American forces steadily westward through the Pacific, but Saipan represented something different. Not just another stepping stone, but a direct threat to Japan's inner defensive perimeter. The Japanese understood this perfectly. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo called Saipan's defense a matter of life and death for the empire. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded approximately 32,000 Japanese troops defending the island, supported by thousands of Japanese civilians who had settled there during decades of imperial expansion. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, was also stationed on Saipan as commander of the Central Pacific Fleet. These men knew that losing Saipan would bring the war to Japan's doorstep. The invasion began on June 15, 1944. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, followed by the Army's 27th Infantry Division, stormed ashore against fierce resistance. Over 3 weeks of savage fighting followed, some of the most intense combat in the Pacific theater. Marines fought through sugarcane fields that provided perfect cover for Japanese machine gun nests. They assaulted fortified positions built into the island's volcanic ridges. They learned that every cave might contain snipers, every depression in the ground might hide a camouflaged pillbox. The Japanese defenders employed their standard doctrine, fighting to the death, using the terrain's natural advantages and making the Americans pay for every yard of ground with blood. By early July, American forces had pushed the remaining Japanese defenders to the island's northern tip, a region of jagged cliffs and honeycombed caves that would become known as Marpi Point. The terrain at Marpi Point is unforgiving. Limestone cliffs rise 200 to 300 feet above the ocean, carved by millennia of wind and waves into countless caves and crevices. Some caves are shallow depressions barely deep enough for a man to crouch. Others tunnel hundreds of feet into the cliff face, connecting through natural passages into labyrinthine networks. The coral limestone is soft enough that Japanese engineers had expanded some caves into fortified positions, but most remained natural formations, irregular, unpredictable, impossible to map. Below the cliffs, volcanic rocks jut from the Pacific, black and sharp enough to shred human flesh. The surf pounds these rocks with relentless violence, creating a constant roar that drowns out human voices. 2 specific locations would become infamous: a cliff face that Marines would call Suicide Cliff, and a steep coral precipice overlooking the ocean that would be named Banzai Cliff. Japanese military doctrine in 1944 was shaped by an ancient warrior tradition called Bushido, but also by specific orders from Tokyo that reflected the empire's increasingly desperate strategic position. Surrender was considered the ultimate disgrace, worse than death. Soldiers received explicit instructions that capture meant dishonor to their families, to their ancestors, to the emperor himself. Military training reinforced this message through brutal conditioning and indoctrination. But the situation on Saipan added another dimension of horror. Approximately 20,000 Japanese civilians lived on the island, including families of colonists, administrators, merchants, and laborers. These civilians had received their own form of indoctrination through schools, community organizations, and government propaganda. They had been told repeatedly that Americans would torture them, rape the women, kill the children, commit atrocities so savage that death was preferable. They had been shown propaganda films depicting Americans as savage beasts. Many genuinely believed these lies. As the battle turned against the Japanese military, both soldiers and civilians retreated to Marpi Point's caves, where propaganda and terror and desperation would converge into tragedy.
The problem confronting American forces was unlike anything they had faced before. Previous Pacific battles had been primarily military engagements. Even when Japanese soldiers fought to the death rather than surrender, which was common, the tactical solution remained straightforward: destroy the enemy's ability to fight. But at Marpi Point, Marines advancing through the caves encountered Japanese civilians alongside soldiers. Families huddled in cave recesses, elderly men and women who could barely walk, children, some as young as infants. These people were terrified, starving, often wounded. Many had been hiding in the caves for days or weeks, surviving on whatever food they had carried, drinking rainwater collected in stone depressions, watching their children waste away. American commanders issued clear orders. These civilians were non-combatants and should be encouraged to surrender. Japanese-speaking interpreters accompanied Marine patrols, carrying loudspeakers, calling into the caves with messages that Americans would provide food, water, medical care, safe passage. The Marines advancing into this nightmare were mostly 19, 20, 21 years old. Kids from Iowa farms and Brooklyn neighborhoods and Texas ranches who had endured 3 weeks of brutal combat and now found themselves trying to coax terrified families out of holes in the ground while Japanese soldiers sometimes still fought from adjacent caves. The innovation Americans employed was psychological warfare, or attempted to employ it. This wasn't about new weapons or tactics, but about trying to overcome propaganda with truth. Military intelligence officers who spoke Japanese prepared scripts for interpreters. These messages emphasized that families would be reunited, that children would receive food, that the wounded would be treated. Some Marine units had Nisei soldiers, second-generation Japanese Americans, who could speak both languages fluently and understand the cultural context. These Nisei risked their lives walking toward cave mouths, calling out in Japanese, trying to build trust. Sometimes it worked. Families would emerge cautiously, children first, the adults following with their hands raised or empty. Marines would immediately provide K-rations, water, cigarettes for the adults. Corpsmen would treat wounds. The families would be escorted to rear area camps where conditions were crowded but safe. But other times, too many times, it failed completely. And what happened when it failed is what haunts survivors to this day. The psychological pressure inside those caves is difficult for modern Americans to comprehend. Imagine you have been told your entire life that surrender equals dishonor, that your enemies are monsters who will violate everything you hold sacred. You have watched your military lose battle after battle. You have seen soldiers you knew die in agony. You are trapped in a limestone hole with your children, and they are crying from hunger, and you can hear the enemy approaching, and you believe, truly believe, that if they take you alive, your children will suffer horrors worse than death. You also know that Japanese soldiers in adjacent caves have grenades. Some have already chosen to pull the pin and hold it to their chests with their families gathered close. You have heard these explosions echoing through the rock. This is not rational thinking. This is trauma, terror, and indoctrination, creating a psychological trap with no escape. American forces tried to counteract this by demonstrating humanity, feeding prisoners, treating wounds, allowing families to stay together, and broadcasting this message into the caves. But propaganda has already done its work. The morning of July 7, 1944 brought the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, led by General Saito and Admiral Nagumo, before both committed ritual suicide, launched a desperate mass attack against American lines. The charge was a tactical disaster. Japanese forces armed with rifles and bayonets, some with nothing but sharpened bamboo poles, running into American machine gun and artillery fire. By dawn, thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead, and American forces pushed forward to complete the island's capture. This desperate charge accelerated what was already beginning at Marpi Point, the final convergence of military defeat and civilian tragedy. Marines advancing along the cliff tops on July 9th reported something that made hardened combat veterans physically ill. Families were jumping from the cliffs. Not one or two individuals making desperate choices, but group after group after group. Mothers holding children, elderly couples holding hands, entire family groups standing at the cliff edge and then simply stepping off. Other Marines watching from positions below the cliffs saw bodies falling, heard the impacts, saw the ocean turn red around the rocks. Corporal Guy Gabaldon, a Nisei Marine who had already convinced hundreds of Japanese civilians and soldiers to surrender, watched through binoculars as a woman threw her baby over the edge, then jumped herself. He would carry that image for the rest of his life. Other Marines attempted to intervene, running toward families at the cliff edge, shouting, reaching out. Sometimes the families ran from them toward the drop. Sometimes Japanese soldiers forced civilians toward the edge at gunpoint. Sometimes the civilians needed no forcing. They walked to their deaths, believing it was salvation.
Inside the caves, the discoveries were different but equally traumatic. Marines clearing cave systems with flamethrowers and grenades would sometimes advance into chambers and find entire families dead from grenades they had detonated themselves. Or they would find bodies of mothers who had strangled their own children before taking poison. Or they would find the living, emaciated families too weak to move, surrounded by the dead they had been unable to bury. Private First Class Robert Graff from Chicago entered one cave and found 7 children, the oldest maybe 10 years old, huddled around 2 dead adults. The children were barely conscious from dehydration. Graff carried them out one by one, and not one child resisted or made a sound. They had given up. Corpsmen worked frantically to save these survivors, but some were too far gone. Dehydration, starvation, infections from untreated wounds. These children had been dying slowly in the darkness, while their parents made calculations about mercy that no parent should ever have to make. The scale of civilian death at Marpi Point remains debated by historians, but the evidence is clear enough. Estimates suggest between 8,000 and 10,000 Japanese civilians died on Saipan, and a significant portion of those deaths occurred at Marpi Point through suicide or murder-suicide. The exact numbers will never be known, because bodies were scattered across rocks, swept out to sea, or buried in cave collapses. What is documented is that American forces collected thousands of civilian bodies from the base of the cliffs and from caves in the weeks following the battle. Burial details worked under the tropical sun, handling decomposing remains, many of them children. These burial details were composed of the same young Marines who had survived 3 weeks of combat. The battle had hardened them to death, or so they thought. But finding children who had been thrown from cliffs by their own parents broke something inside these men that combat never had. The immediate aftermath was chaos managed by exhausted troops trying to provide humanitarian aid while still clearing Japanese holdouts from caves. The army established refugee camps where surviving Japanese civilians received food, shelter, and medical care. These camps were overcrowded and undersupplied initially, but conditions improved as the military logistics system caught up with the unexpected number of civilian survivors. Approximately 10,000 civilians ultimately survived the battle. Many had surrendered only after seeing other families treated well. Some had been physically pulled back from cliff edges by Marines who grabbed them at the last second. Others had hidden in caves until starvation forced them out weeks after the fighting ended. The psychological condition of these survivors was severe. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, trauma from prolonged combat exposure, grief from losing family members, and cognitive dissonance from discovering that everything they had been told about Americans was a lie. American military doctors and nurses worked with these survivors, but in 1944, there was limited understanding of psychological trauma, and language barriers complicated everything. Some civilians remained hostile, refusing treatment, turning their faces to the wall and waiting to die. Others, especially children, recovered with remarkable resilience once they received food and safety. The strategic consequences of Saipan's capture were exactly what Japanese leaders had feared. Within months, B-29 bombers flying from newly constructed airfields on Saipan and neighboring Tinian began regular bombing raids on the Japanese home islands. The capture of Saipan effectively ended Japan's defensive perimeter and made ultimate defeat inevitable, a reality the Japanese military and political leaders understood. Prime Minister Tojo's government fell shortly after Saipan's loss, though Tojo himself did not accept responsibility for the civilian catastrophe at Marpi Point. The battle also provided a grim preview of what American forces could expect if they invaded the Japanese home islands. If propaganda could drive thousands of civilians to suicide on Saipan, what would happen when American forces landed on Honshu or Kyushu? This question influenced American strategic planning and contributed to debates about whether invasion or other methods, including the atomic bombs ultimately dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would cost fewer lives overall. The tactical lessons were documented immediately in after-action reports and intelligence assessments. The U.S. military began developing more sophisticated psychological warfare techniques for dealing with Japanese civilian populations. On subsequent island invasions, notably Okinawa, American forces put greater emphasis on civilian protection, used more Japanese-speaking personnel, and prepared for mass civilian casualties from suicide. The phrase "suicide cliff" became shorthand in military briefings for the phenomenon of civilian mass suicide, driven by propaganda and fear. Marine and Army training after Saipan included specific instruction on identifying civilian refugees, protecting non-combatants, and understanding Japanese cultural beliefs about honor and surrender. Though this training was often superficial and could not fully prepare young soldiers for the psychological burden of watching families die by their own hands.
But the deepest consequences were psychological and moral, carried by the men who witnessed these events. Marines who watched families jump from cliffs developed trauma that their military training had never prepared them for. They had been trained to fight enemy soldiers, to storm fortified positions, to endure combat's physical dangers. They had not been trained to watch mothers kill their children. Many of these men did not speak about what they saw at Marpi Point for decades, not to their wives, not to their children, not to therapists or chaplains. Some developed drinking problems or rage issues that destroyed marriages. Some woke up screaming from nightmares of bodies falling or children's faces in dark caves. Corpsmen who had treated wounded Marines under fire with steady hands found themselves shaking uncontrollably when they remembered treating starving children pulled from caves. The moral injury, the wound to the soul that comes from witnessing atrocity, proved more difficult to heal than physical wounds. Guy Gabaldon, the Nisei Marine who convinced more than 1,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender on Saipan, received the Navy Cross for his actions, but he also carried nightmares of the families he could not save. In interviews decades later, Gabaldon described the helplessness of watching people die who wanted to die, whose beliefs had trapped them more effectively than any cave. He described trying to grab a woman's arm as she jumped and missing by inches. He described the sound, which he could never forget, of bodies hitting rocks 200 feet below. Gabaldon's story became relatively well known because of his exceptional success at preventing deaths, but there were hundreds of other Marines whose names are not famous, who tried just as hard and failed just as often, who saved some people and watched others die, and who carried that weight in silence. The caves at Marpi Point are still there, weathered by 70 years of Pacific storms, but essentially unchanged. The cliffs are now tourist sites, marked with memorials in Japanese and English. The Japanese government erected monuments to the civilians who died,
and these monuments use language that sometimes romanticizes the deaths as noble sacrifice, rather than acknowledging them as tragedies born from propaganda and terror. American veterans have sometimes objected to this framing, arguing that the truth matters, that these were not heroic sacrifices, but preventable deaths caused by militarism and lies. Some Japanese survivors of Saipan have spoken publicly about their experiences, describing the propaganda they believed and the trauma of watching family members die. Their testimonies provide crucial counter-narrative to any attempt to glorify what happened.
The historical debate continues about responsibility. Were these deaths caused by Japanese propaganda and military culture? By American tactical decisions during the battle? By the inherent nature of total war in the Pacific? Most serious historians acknowledge multiple causation. Japanese government propaganda created the beliefs that made families choose death, but the American military's island-hopping strategy created the battlefield conditions, and the larger context of imperial expansion and global war created the entire catastrophe. Assigning singular blame misses the point. What matters is understanding how thoroughly war can corrupt human psychology, how propaganda can turn protective parents into killers of their own children, and how young soldiers sent to fight can become traumatized witnesses to atrocities they are powerless to prevent. Marines who survived Saipan came home to a country that wanted to celebrate heroes and victories, not discuss mothers throwing babies from cliffs. The war had to be a righteous crusade against evil, which it was, but that narrative left no room for the moral complexity of what happened at places like Marpi Point. So the veterans stayed quiet. They marched in parades and attended reunions and told sanitized stories about combat. The nightmares they kept private. The images they could not unsee remained locked inside, corroding them slowly. Only in recent decades, as historians have pushed for more complete accounting of the Pacific War's reality, have some of these stories begun to emerge. Oral history projects have recorded elderly veterans finally speaking about what they saw in those caves, speaking because they are dying and want someone to know the truth before it disappears with them. The truth is that war creates situations where there are no good choices, only gradations of horror. The Marines at Marpi Point did not fail morally. They tried desperately to save lives, often at risk to themselves. But they were placed in an impossible situation by decisions made far above their pay grade, by military strategies and propaganda campaigns, and imperial ambitions they had no control over. The Japanese civilians who died were not weak or foolish. They were victims of systematic indoctrination that convinced them lies were truth. Their deaths were not suicides in the sense of rational choice. They were murders committed by propaganda, by militarism, by the corruption of human belief systems for political purposes. What they found inside Saipan's caves was not hidden treasure or secret weapons or military intelligence. What they found was the ultimate cost of total war. Innocents destroyed, families obliterated, and the human capacity for hope so thoroughly poisoned by fear and lies that death seemed like salvation. The Marines who pulled children from those caves, who tried to grab the hands of people jumping from cliffs, who heard the explosions of grenades detonated by families choosing death together, these men confronted an enemy that bullets could not kill. The enemy of ideology twisted into madness, of trust destroyed, of humanity degraded until parents could murder their children, believing it was mercy. The lesson is not complicated, though living with it is unbearable. War does not simply kill bodies, it kills the capacity to hope, to trust, to believe in safety. It turns protective instincts into instruments of death, and the young people sent to fight it, whether American Marines or Japanese soldiers or civilians caught between, carry those psychological wounds forever, long after the physical battlefield has been reclaimed by jungle and memorial plaques. The veterans of Marpi Point did not need monuments or celebrations. They needed someone to understand that what they witnessed in those caves was not a military operation, but a human catastrophe, and that the burden of that witness is a weight no one should carry alone.